on the ground. Now.
I'm not resisting.
You think that uniform makes you untouchable? You think those ribbons mean I salute you?
My identification is valid. You can confirm it through command.
I don't answer to your
Package
command.
classified federal material.
Here is what the cameras caught. A Navy senior chief in full dress blues, decorated, commissioned, fresh off a covert extraction from Iranian territory, is forced face down onto an airport floor by an officer who has decided, without evidence and without question, that he does not belong there. Here is what the cameras did not know. The sealed packet that skids across the terminal floor in those next few seconds contains classified counterintelligence assessments tied to infrastructure vulnerabilities. One of those vulnerabilities belongs to the very airport where it is now lying open on the public floor. The officer does not know this. He does not know much about the man he has just put on the ground. That is precisely the problem. Before we go back 11 minutes to where this started, if you are watching this and you want to know how it ends, make sure you are subscribed. Drop a like if this story deserves to be heard. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Stories like this one travel far. We want to know how far. Now, rewind. 6:22 p.m. Sunday evening. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Atlanta, Georgia. One of the busiest civilian transit hubs in the world, a place built on the architecture of movement, where arrivals and departures overlap in a constant, forgettable rhythm. Most of the people moving through the concourse that evening were not paying attention to anyone around them. Business travelers pulled rolling bags past gate signage without looking up. Families regrouped near baggage claim with the low, distracted energy of people mentally already home. Flight crews moved in practiced clusters, accustomed to being invisible. One man was not invisible. Senior Chief Thomas Kennedy was 39 years old, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Command. 17 years in uniform. 3 Bronze Stars. 2 classified commendations that would never appear on any public record. The kind of service history that accumulates in silence and earns its weight without ceremony. Less than 72 hours earlier, Kennedy had been extracted from hostile territory inside Iran after a covert operation collapsed under gunfire. The details of that mission were classified and would remain so. What was not classified were the marks it had left on him, a sutured cut above his right eyebrow, rib bruising that tightened every breath, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had not closed his eyes in over 40 hours. He wore his dress blues. Not for appearance. Not for attention. He had been directed into the civilian terminal on a military transport connection reroute, and the uniform was standard protocol for the formal debrief waiting at Naval Station Norfolk. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and a sealed Department of Defense packet under his arm, its classification markings visible to anyone who looked closely enough. His posture was straight. His pace was even. His eyes were forward. He was a wounded serviceman trying to move from one gate to another inside his own country, and everything about the way he carried himself communicated a single, uncomplicated fact: he had been through worse than a connecting flight. He just wanted to reach his gate. Officer Gregory Everson had been with the Atlanta Airport Police Department for 15 years. In that time, 37 complaints had been filed against him, the majority by Black and Latino travelers, overwhelmingly involving unprovoked stops, aggressive questioning, and detentions that produced no actionable outcome. Every complaint had been processed through the department's internal review structure. Every complaint had been cleared. Some were labeled misunderstandings. Others were filed with language about the complexity of high-volume environments and officer discretion under pressure. None of them had changed anything. Within the department, Everson's style was characterized, by supervisors who reviewed his record charitably, as proactive enforcement. He was known for moving into situations rather than waiting for them to develop, for reading crowds with a pattern recognition instinct that his evaluations called an asset and that his complaint history suggested was something considerably more specific. His patrol partner that evening was Officer Dale Marsh, 31 years old, for years on the job. Marsh was quieter by temperament, alert to the crowd, and had understood quickly in his time beside Everson that questioning his partner's reads was not something that produced a productive shift. He stayed half a step back and watched without intervening. Everson's eyes had been moving across the concourse in the manner of a man who has already decided what he is looking for. And then they stopped. A black man in full navy dress blues. Duffel bag on one shoulder. Sealed envelope under one arm. Bandaged hand. Cut above the eyebrow. Eyes that had the particular weight of someone running on the last reserves of something. Most people in that terminal, if they had looked, would have seen what was standing in front of them, a serviceman coming home, worn from wherever he had been, moving with the controlled economy of someone trained to complete a task regardless of the cost. Everson was already moving. He stepped directly into Kennedy's path. The gap between them collapsed to less than 2 feet. Kennedy stopped. His posture remained straight, his expression neutral, his tone precisely level. He identified himself. He offered his military ID and travel documents with a calm that suggested he had been in situations far more difficult than this one and had learned, somewhere along the way, that composure was the only leverage a man sometimes had. Everson examined the credentials the way a man examines something he has already determined to disbelieve. He turned the identification over. He looked at the photograph and then back at the man in front of him and then back at the photograph again. Then he handed the documents to Marsh without a word. Kennedy requested a supervisor. The temperature changed. The request was calm and procedural, the language of a man who understood chain of command and was applying it correctly. It was not a challenge. It was not a provocation. It was the appropriate response to a situation that had no appropriate basis for existing. Everson did not process it that way. He instructed Kennedy to put down his belongings. Kennedy lowered the duffel to the floor. He did not release the sealed packet. His voice was steady, unhurried, professional. The packet contained classified material. He was not authorized to surrender it to civilian law enforcement. This was not a refusal born of defiance. It was a statement of protocol, the same protocol that governed the document's existence, its classification, its transit, and its handling. Everson stepped closer. His next words were spoken at a volume that carried beyond the two of them, to Marsh, to the travelers who had begun to slow, to the phones that had not yet risen but were already in motion toward the pockets they lived in. The words were not about the packet. They were not about the identification. They were about the uniform, and the man wearing it, and what Everson had already decided that combination did and did not mean. Kennedy said nothing in response. He had nothing to prove here, and he understood, with the particular clarity of someone trained to read threat environments, that the moment had already moved past the point where words would resolve it. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Everson reached out and grabbed Kennedy's arm, not the uninjured one. The hand wrapped in gauze. The grip was immediate and decisive, fingers closing around the wrist with the full authority of a man who had done this before and expected no resistance. Kennedy did not pull away. He did not shift his weight. He did not raise his hands or square his shoulders or do any of the things a man who is not trained might do when his body is suddenly seized by another. He had been through things in the last 72 hours that would have unmade most people, and his nervous system had been calibrated by years of training to operate clearly in the specific space between restraint and the instinct to respond to force. He held the packet under his arm. He said, clearly, that he was not resisting. That the document was classified. Everson drove his open hand into Kennedy's upper back and shoved him forward. His knees hit the tile first. Then his shoulder. Then the side of his face. The sound of the impact traveled through the concourse in the particular way that sudden, violent sounds travel through spaces designed for ordinary movement, absorbed first by silence, then followed by it. The sealed packet spun free from under his arm and skidded across the white floor, coming to rest near a row of plastic seats, its classification markings facing upward, exposed to every lens in the terminal. Everson pressed his knee between Kennedy's shoulder blades and pulled both arms behind his back. The gauze on Kennedy's hand tore open. Blood moved across the white tile with the slow, indifferent certainty of something that had been waiting. Bystanders had gone still. A wall of phones surrounded them, screens lit, viewer counts already climbing. A retired officer in a veteran's cap pushed forward from the crowd. His voice was hard and certain, the voice of a man who recognized what he was looking at and understood the full weight of what was happening to it. He did not reach the officers before a terminal staffer moved to intercept him. Marsh stood at Kennedy's feet and did not look at the crowd. Kennedy's cheek was pressed flat against the cold terminal floor. His breathing was controlled. The ribbon rack on his chest, the compressed biography of 17 years of service in places most people would never go, scraped against the white tile with every shallow inhale. The body camera on Everson's chest blinked red. It recorded everything, including the words, spoken close to Kennedy's ear, that would later become the centerpiece of a federal indictment. Including the moment, for seconds after those words, when Everson's hand reached up and manually muted the audio. He did not know that the ceiling microphones above Concourse B were still running. Somewhere inside a federal monitoring office that tracks classified personnel in transit, a travel flag that had been active since Kennedy departed a forward staging area in the Middle East went inactive at 6:29 p.m. A travel flag going inactive mid-transit was not normal. The analyst who noticed it pulled up the associated transit file, cross-referenced the classification tier, and reached for his phone. The call he made would not be answered for another 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, the sealed packet containing counterintelligence assessments tied to domestic infrastructure vulnerabilities, including vulnerabilities connected to U.S. transportation hubs, including the one it was currently lying on the floor of, remained visible to every camera in the terminal. The man responsible for protecting it was still on the floor. His posture was still controlled. He had not released the packet willingly. He had not released it at all. Sergeant Danielle Ruiz came around the corner of Concourse B at a pace that was not quite running but communicated everything running would have. She had heard the radio call. She had heard the voices carrying down the terminal from a distance that told her whatever was unfolding had already gathered an audience. 18 years on the job had calibrated her instincts past the point of needing visual confirmation before preparing for the worst. But nothing in 18 years had prepared her for what was waiting at the end of that corridor. She stopped mid-stride. A man in full navy dress blues was on the floor. His right hand, the one wrapped in gauze, was bleeding openly, the bandage shredded at the wrist, blood visible against the white tile in a pattern that had already spread beyond the point of being contained. The cut above his eyebrow had reopened. The ribbon rack on his chest, the kind accumulated only through years of sustained service in conditions most people would spend their lives never encountering, was pressed against the floor at an angle no uniform was designed to survive. A sealed military dossier sat 10 feet away near a row of plastic seats, its classification markings facing upward, exposed to the full width of the concourse, visible to every camera and every phone that had already been raised around the perimeter of the scene. Ruiz moved. She covered the distance between herself and Everson in 4 steps, placed herself between him and the crowd, and looked down at the man on the floor. Then she looked at the dossier. Then she looked at Everson with an expression that carried a weight he did not immediately register. She reached out and took the military ID from Marsh's hand. She read it fully. She read it again. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Naval Special Warfare Command. She stood and looked at Everson with a stillness that, to anyone watching, communicated something far more dangerous than volume. She told him to take the cuffs off. Everson did not move immediately. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has not yet understood that the ground beneath him has already shifted. Ruiz did not repeat herself. The instruction remained in the air between them, patient and absolute, until Marsh stepped forward and removed the restraints. Kennedy rose from the tile slowly. Not with difficulty, with deliberateness, the controlled ascent of a man who will not allow the manner of his rising to suggest anything other than composure. His right hand bled freely. The cut above his eyebrow had reopened along the suture line. He flexed his fingers once, absorbing the damage with the economy of someone trained to inventory injury without reacting to it, and then he stood straight. Ruiz secured the dossier by its edges, careful not to disturb the classification markings, and tucked it under her arm. She keyed her radio and requested her commanding officer at the concourse immediately, her voice measured, the specific language she used over the open frequency chosen with the precision of someone who already understood the severity of what she was managing. She walked Kennedy away from the crowd and into a small conference room at the end of a side corridor used for internal briefings. She offered him water and a chair. He took both. His posture remained straight, but the exhaustion that had been pressing against the edges of his control for the better part of 2 days was visible now in the stillness of a man who has finally stopped moving long enough for the weight to find him. Airport Chief Julius Pratt arrived within 6 minutes. He was the kind of man who did not telegraph alarm through expression or movement, and the fact that his face shifted the moment he saw the classification markings on the dossier told Ruiz everything she needed to know about how this was going to move from here. He picked up the phone and made a call that lasted under 4 minutes. His side of the conversation was clipped, factual, and deeply careful. When he hung up, he looked at Ruiz and told her what was coming. 14 minutes later, 2 men entered the terminal through a side access corridor without stopping at any checkpoint. One carried NCIS credentials. The other carried a Defense Intelligence Agency identification that required no further elaboration. Neither of them sat down. They secured the dossier first, confirmed its integrity, and then asked to be taken to the body cam footage. The playback happened in a closed room down the hall from where Kennedy was still sitting with his water and his straight posture and his silence. The footage was clear and unambiguous. It showed the initial stop, unprovoked, proximate, the posture of a man who had already made a decision before the exchange began. It showed the credentials being produced calmly and dismissed without examination. It showed the request for a supervisor being met with escalation rather than process. It showed the grab, the twist, the shove. It showed the sound of a body striking tile and the particular, awful stillness that followed before the cuffs came out. And then it showed something else. At the 41-second mark of the footage, the body cam audio went silent. Not corrupted. Not lost. Manually muted, the indicator light shifting in a way consistent with a deliberate input. The DIA officer noted the timestamp without expression and made a notation in the file he was building. The footage continued without sound for 42 seconds. Then the audio returned. What the footage could not recover, the ceiling microphone network above Concourse B had already preserved. The airport's overhead audio system, a component of the terminal's security infrastructure that operated independently of officer equipment and synced automatically to a central time signature, had recorded everything the body cam had been instructed to miss. The DIA officer listened to the recovered audio once. Then he stepped out of the room and made a single phone call in the corridor, his voice flat and conclusive, and returned without explaining what had been said. Pratt looked at Ruiz. She already knew. Everson and Marsh were pulled from active duty within the hour. Radios, weapons, badges, body cameras, everything was surrendered at the shift commander's desk with the procedural efficiency of a department that understood, even before the federal paperwork arrived, that the time for internal management had passed. By midnight, a college student's live stream of the arrest had reached 3 million views. The clip had been shared before Ruiz even reached Kennedy's side, captured from the concourse crowd at a distance that nonetheless preserved every audible detail of the encounter, the commands, the impact, the controlled, repeated statements of a man who would not stop identifying his status or the nature of the document he was protecting even with his face against the floor. By morning, it had been picked up by national outlets. By noon, it had been replayed on screens in 47 countries. The clips that circulated most widely were not the loudest moments. They were the quiet ones. The ribbon rack against the white tile. The blood on the floor. The sealed packet spinning away across the concourse. The composed, deliberate statement, narrated by witnesses who had been standing close enough to hear it clearly, that the document was classified and could not be surrendered. That detail, more than any other, seemed to reach people in the particular way that details reach people when they illuminate something larger than themselves. The Pentagon statement was released at 4:17 p.m. the following day. Its language was more direct than most observers expected from an institution known for the careful architecture of its public communications. It confirmed that an active-duty naval special warfare operator had been subjected to racially motivated excessive force while traveling under classified military orders. It confirmed that the operator had maintained protocol throughout the encounter. It did not speculate on outcome. It did not need to. The Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation before the end of the business day. Federal jurisdiction was invoked by the following morning, the invocation grounded not only in the civil rights dimensions of the assault but in the additional layer introduced by the classified material, its exposure on a public terminal floor now elevated from a procedural failure to a matter of federal security consequence. The jurisdictional basis alone broadened the potential charge architecture considerably. Legal analysts, appearing on programs throughout the evening cycle, described the combination of the body cam footage, the recovered ceiling audio, Everson's complaint history, and the classified material exposure as a federal case of unusual structural completeness. The kind of case, several noted carefully, that prosecutors do not often receive in this assembled condition. Charges under consideration included federal civil rights violations, assault under color of law, interference with active military operations, and conduct contributing to the compromise of classified federal materials. Maximum combined exposure, 35 years. The number circulated through every platform that had already been carrying the footage, arriving in comment sections and broadcast cheer-ins with the particular weight of a figure that feels abstract until the context behind it is understood. Then, from inside the department's own archived records, something else surfaced. Investigators pulling Everson's complaint file discovered an internal email, sent 4 years earlier by a deputy chief whose name was now attached to a pending state appointment. The email did not recommend discipline. It did not flag concern. In language that was administrative in form and revelatory in implication, it characterized Everson's enforcement style as an asset in maintaining terminal order. The deputy chief's appointment process was placed under review by the following afternoon. The case had stopped being about one officer. The ceiling audio was 9 minutes and 14 seconds long. It began 3 seconds before Everson's body camera audio went silent and it ended 12 seconds after the audio returned. It had been preserved automatically by the terminal's overhead security system, a system designed to run continuously, independent of officer equipment, time-stamped to the millisecond against a central server clock that made synchronization with the body cam footage a straightforward technical exercise. Federal investigators completed that synchronization in under 2 hours. What the recovered segment contained was not complicated to understand. It was not ambiguous in tone or intent or implication. It was the voice of a man who believed, in those 42 seconds, that he had removed the record of what he was saying from the permanent account of what had happened. It was the voice of a man who did not know the building was still listening. The language captured in those 42 seconds did not describe a security concern. It did not reference the classified packet, or the travel documents, or any operational judgment about the encounter that had just occurred. It referenced the man on the floor in terms that confirmed, with a clarity that required no interpretation, that the decision to put him there had not been made on the basis of threat assessment. The DIA officer who reviewed the audio added a single notation to the federal file: discriminatory intent established. Recommend full indictment. The notation was 3 words longer than it needed to be. The complaint file that investigators pulled on Everson was 22 pages long. It covered 15 years and 27 separate filings. The overwhelming majority had been submitted by Black and Latino travelers. The documented incidents followed a pattern consistent enough to constitute a methodology: unprovoked stops, credential refusals, physical detentions that produced no arrests and no subsequent justification beyond officer discretion, notations that repeated the same language with a regularity suggesting template use rather than genuine documentation. 6 of the 27 complaints had been filed by current or former members of the military. 3 of those 6 had been dismissed without any recorded investigative step beyond the receipt of the initial filing. Federal investigators contacted former complainants. 19 responded within 48 hours. Their accounts, taken separately and cross-referenced against the documented record, built a portrait of conduct that had been functional and visible within the department for years, not concealed so much as consistently reframed as enforcement productivity, the language of the institution bending itself into a shape that could absorb what the evidence was actually describing. The internal email from the deputy chief was entered into the federal record on the 4th day of investigation. By the end of that week, the department had assigned federal compliance monitors to the airport police command structure. The monitors arrived quietly, without press notice, and began reviewing supervisory records from the previous 7 years with the systematic patience of people who are not operating under a timeline anyone else controls. On the 8th day after the arrest, the full dimensions of Kennedy's mission became relevant to the federal record in a way that had not been publicly anticipated. The classified packet that had spent approximately 4 minutes exposed on the floor of a public terminal, photographed by an unknown number of civilian devices before Ruiz secured it, contained counterintelligence assessments compiled from Kennedy's most recent deployment. Those assessments included counter-surveillance findings tied to a coordinated digital intrusion campaign targeting U.S. transportation infrastructure. The intrusion had been partially mapped and partially disrupted as a direct result of Kennedy's extraction and the intelligence he carried out of Iranian territory. The disruption had prevented the campaign from advancing to an operational phase. Among the infrastructure categories identified in the assessments as primary targets, domestic aviation hubs. Kennedy had been arrested inside one of them. He had been carrying the documentation of its vulnerability under his arm while being accused, by the officer who put him on the floor, of not belonging there. The irony of that fact was noted, with the particular restraint of people who deal professionally in facts rather than narrative, by 3 separate federal attorneys working the case independently. None of them put it in writing in exactly those terms. The record, assembled correctly, said it without requiring them to. The packet's exposure did not ultimately result in confirmed intelligence compromise. The counterintelligence team concluded that the photographs taken of the classification markings by civilian devices were unlikely to have been captured or exploited within the operational window before Ruiz secured the document. The assessment was cautious and qualified, as such assessments are required to be, and it did not erase the fact of the exposure or the federal charge category it supported. It meant only that the damage had been contained. By Kennedy. Even on the floor. Everson was formally suspended without pay on the 6th day following the arrest. His badge was surrendered at the shift commander's desk. His firearm was collected by a federal agent rather than a department supervisor, the distinction carrying a weight that everyone present understood. The same process was applied to Marsh with a charge architecture that reflected his role, present, compliant, and ultimately unwilling to intervene, rather than initiating. Federal prosecutors filed initial charges 11 days after the arrest. The charge document was 43 pages long and covered 4 separate federal statutes. The civil rights violation count alone carried a potential sentence that, combined with the remaining charges, produced the 35-year figure that had been circulating since the first week. Legal analysts reviewing the filing described its construction as methodical, not aggressive, not performative, but assembled with the kind of procedural precision that suggests the case was built to survive appeal rather than to generate headlines. The courthouse steps on the morning of the filing had gathered several hundred people by 8 in the morning. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and ordinary people who had seen the footage and arrived without affiliation or agenda, standing together in the particular silence of a crowd that has already said what it came to say simply by being present. No speeches. No amplification. The gathering communicated what it meant to communicate and then dispersed in the measured way of people who understand that the work is happening inside, not outside, and that their presence was a statement, not a demand. Kennedy returned to limited duty quietly. There was no statement. No press availability. No carefully managed appearance designed to translate his experience into political or social currency. He returned the way he had arrived at the airport that Sunday evening, with his posture straight, his pace even, and his eyes forward. The ribbons on his chest told the same story they had always told, to anyone who knew how to read them, and he did not add to it. What emerged from the federal testimony process, in the careful, procedural language of evidentiary record rather than public narrative, was a single additional fact that required no elaboration. The counterintelligence findings Kennedy had carried out of Iran, and protected on the floor of a public terminal, and refused to surrender even as his hand bled and his face was pressed against the tile, had contributed materially to the disruption of a coordinated cyber campaign. That campaign, had it reached operational phase, would have targeted the navigation and communications systems of domestic aviation infrastructure. He had been protecting the airport where he was arrested. He had been doing it the entire time. That fact did not appear in any headline. It did not circulate on any platform. It lived in the federal record, accessible to the investigators and prosecutors and intelligence officials who needed it, inaccessible to everyone else in the manner of facts that are classified not to conceal their existence but to protect their continued utility. Kennedy knew what he had been carrying. He had always known. Outside the federal courthouse, the case moved through its early procedural phases with the unhurried momentum of a federal prosecution that has no reason to rush. The evidence was complete. The record was assembled. The sealing audio had been authenticated, the complaint history entered, the internal email preserved, the classified material implications documented, and the 42 seconds of deliberate silence accounted for in a way that left no interpretive gap requiring speculation to fill. The country was watching. Not with the compressed urgency of a news cycle, but with the quieter, more durable attention of people who understand that the resolution of something this visible will say something consequential, about accountability, about who the systems of protection protect, about whether the distance between what a man endures and what he is owed can ever actually be closed. Kennedy was not waiting for an apology. He was not waiting for recognition, or restoration, or the public acknowledgement of a wrong that the footage had already made irrefutable. He was waiting for a system to do what systems are built to do when they are functioning as they were designed, to process the evidence, apply the law, and deliver a result that does not require the person most harmed to perform his pain in order to earn it. The cameras were still rolling. The footage would be played in court. The ceiling had heard everything. And the question that remained, the one the footage and the audio and the 43-page charge document and the assembly on the courthouse steps had all been building toward, was not whether the evidence was sufficient. It was whether the outcome would be.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.